Welcome back to another episode of Money Moves. I hope you like that intro. That is a very dope video that was made by friend of the show, Amplis. He's going to be doing some more stuff with us. I really am excited to share this interview with Brett Scott, the author of Cloudmoney. But before we get into the interview, you should come to our blog, our Substack, whatever you want to call it. It's flywheeloutput.org. And we're going to have some very great breakdown of the discussion that we're having here. This is something new that we're adding to the Flywheel series, is that in addition to the amazing voice content, video content that we have, we're also going to be starting to put out a lot of written content as a supplementary, more about like opinions. In this case, I'll be doing a small review of Cloudmoney and then getting into some of the deeper aspects of what we talked about inside this discussion with Brett. Now, you can find all of that at flywheeloutput.org. You can find it in the show notes right down below. So come sign up and get all this insights delivered straight to your email every single day with just one click of a button. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in, and let's hop into the interview with Brett. Today, I am joined by Brett Scott, who is the author of Cloudmoney, Cash, Cards, and Crypto, and the War for Our Wallets. I found this book a couple of weeks ago in my research, and even before I started reading the book, I knew that I wanted to have you on, Brett. I read the short paragraph that talked about what you were trying to, or like the summary of the book, and it really aligned with what we're covering here in this podcast series and through our work here at Flywheel. Just about my background for a little bit. So back in the early 2000s, I worked as a signals intelligence analyst in the Marine Corps that was adjacent to the NSA. So we used all the NSA databases. We did metadata analysis where I was just essentially staring at a giant Excel spreadsheet looking for interesting metadata based on information that the government had collected through different means of surveillance. Obviously, all of this information came out in 2007, 2008, when Snowden published his documents, essentially showing the abuses that the government had perpetrated using these collection systems. And not only that, but the close relationships that the government had with big tech at the time to essentially give them backdoors into their private systems that they had to be able to collect data on pretty much every single American inside the United States. And at the time, I thought this would be shocking, but the collective response that came out of that was essentially a nothing burger. I mean, here we are, almost 15 years onward from that time. And there hasn't really been too much of a response or legal proceedings. Nobody went to jail for this, right? You had the NSA director essentially get up and lie to the American public saying, we're not spying on American people. And that was back in 2008, right? And here we are in 2023, where we've had another 15 years of technological development. We've had even more close relations built between governments and big tech, who are now encroaching on the financial space, as you write about in your book. And the thing that kind of pushed me in my direction, and maybe you in your direction as well too, but maybe in just a different political ideological direction, was this fusing of the state and corporate sector in this modern surveillance economy. So I think the question, and I think this is why we agree. So like just starting out, I mean, like I'm a big proponent of cash, and you're also a big proponent of cash, but probably for different reasons, right? I always come back to my own experiences of working in the intelligence agencies and understanding that at the core of everything, privacy is a deep and necessary right that every person has to have in order to live a free and a free existence in which they have liberty and autonomy. Now, I understand that there's social requirements that we need to adhere to, but at its core, I understand that like the individual is really important when it comes to having this privacy, not only privacy in their communications, but also financial privacy as well too. And so what we're building in our modern monetary system, and I'd like to start here, is this weird fusion. And I guess my first question is it possible to have a system where the government and banks and big tech are all colluding to capture as much financial information as possible and run it through these huge data collection systems to screen for like AML, financial terrorism, tax avoidance, whatever they want to call it, right? Is it possible to have that and not move towards a system of I don't really have a word for it, but a system of like total information awareness between all three of these entities, but also have a strong sense of financial privacy for the individual?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me on, and interesting to hear about your background. That sounds like an interesting set of skills you got there. And yeah, I mean, look. So as you're saying, Cloudmoney is basically looking at the fusion of big finance and big tech. Big finance has always also had a fusion with the state, right? So de facto, the monetary system is underpinned by both the state and the commercial banking sector, which in turn then underpins the rest of the financial system. And then the large big tech players basically can't operate unless they lock into that same infrastructure, right? Because, if you're Amazon and so on, like even beyond data collection, you basically can't, your business model relies upon you having digital payments, right? The whole thing about big tech is precisely that they have to automate everything, right? So they literally can't operate with the cash system. Because, cash is a offline, physical, peer-to-peer, non-automated form of payment, basically, which jars completely against the kind of trajectory of digital capitalism, if you want to call it that. So, yeah, I mean, de facto, this is a trend that's been going on between the sort of fusion of big finance, big tech, and also then these like state players. Whether you can, and of course, if you sort of project that forward in time and you to imagine the most dystopian scenarios that emerge from that, you can imagine some pretty terrifying things, like kind of like, a bit like what you imagine in cyberpunk science fiction.
I mean, you see it in China, right? Where the state has essentially unfettered access to social media, banking, and a surveillance system of like CCTV cameras and other means to essentially track every single person inside the country, right? That's the kind of dystopian.
Yeah, well, the technical capacity to do that is getting bigger. Whether they actually act upon it or not is a different story. China's a complex case. I mean, it's like a massive, massive country, right?
Right.
The government has 2 million members in the party. Like it's a very large scale kind of thing. So got to be a little bit like, I guess, it's hard to sort of generalize on China. Even the social credit system in China is like, I think it's still a work in progress.
Yeah.
But yes, I guess the point to make is that the potentiality or the technical capacity for very large scale forms of financial surveillance and financial censorship is definitely increasing across the world, and it's not only in China; it's in all sorts of places, right?
Yeah.
And I guess that the question of can you sort of carve out forms of privacy in the midst of that really depends partly on how strong your kind of political culture is and how strong your citizens are.
Yeah. See, I'm of the view that the government is always going to exploit whatever data it has access to. And it's already been proven that there's really close relationships between all of the three-letter intelligence agencies and Google, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, they had all these Twitter files, right? That just came out that showed the level of interaction between these agencies, like direct communication between them. And then also the banking system as well, too, where there's been, obviously for under the Bank Secrecy Act, post 9/11, what was that? Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the post 9/11 bill, but essentially, in the names of the Patriot Act, essentially destroying any last vestige of bank secrecy and financial privacy in the name of, like I said, tax avoidance, terrorism, whatever they want to call it, right? This has essentially allowed the government to get to the point where I don't think you can unbreak that and go back. I think the cat's out of the bag now, and that to think that anything within digital forms of money, it's always going to have some level of surveillance into it, right? So then the question really becomes like, do you trust the government who is operating all of this, right? Like, can you trust the United States government? I think so, right? We have hopefully good leaders. And typically, if there is any sort of malfeasance, it comes out, right? Like that story that just came out yesterday in Arizona about how law enforcement's using a backdoor into Wells Fargo to collect, hundreds of millions of dollars, or hundreds of millions of financial transactions and pass them on to law enforcement each year, right? Of stuff happening globally. So I think all this will come to light eventually. The question is like, are you living in a space where your government is either a neutral actor or a good actor? Because if that's the case, then sure. I mean, maybe there's not too much of a threat. But if you're living in a different country where it's moving towards some sort of authoritarianism or dictatorship or some sort of communist surveillance state, I would be much more alarmed, really, because then you get to the point where, the ability for governments to use the financial system as a weapon and to commit human rights abuses is really a core theme of modern finance going forward, right? And one that really kind of worries me the most. It actually brought me into the crypto space, because the thing that I thought about crypto at the time was that here's a means of payment that can be something like cash and have anonymity attached to it, right? Maybe not in Bitcoin, but as we go forward with like ZK proofs, right, and other things, we might have the ability to create a form of money which is fully private, and you can disclose certain parts of your privacy to whom you want to, and that kind of seems to be the right direction to go towards. And so when we talk about cash, which obviously you cover in the book, cash is a system where you and I can exchange as much money as we can carry, right, or stuff into a briefcase, and pass back and forth, and nobody really knows about that transaction. And then once I hand my briefcase to you, that's it, right? It's on your requirement to then declare that transaction and pay taxes on it and do whatever with it. But there's no one that can actually stop us from passing that briefcase back and forth. And I think that's where we're getting, or at least that was the goal of crypto, right? Is to essentially move that briefcase into the digital space and be able to pass that briefcase back and forth without any sort of third-party
Sure, like the
intervention or
digital
mediation.
bearer instrument.
Exactly, right. So is that the argument? Is it like, that's kind of where I'm coming on from cash. So maybe you could talk about like where you're coming from the cash perspective and why you think cash is so important
Yeah,
for
sure.
our
I mean, I
modern
think
economy.
if you're coming from a more like maybe a libertarian perspective, which lots of people in the crypto world tend to be at least partly inspired by forms of libertarianism, the main concern tends to be privacy, right? So the fact that you'll be able to have a state that watches transactions. Okay, so like that's like one element of what I'd be concerned about. But then I come from a much more left-wing background, so I have a bunch of other things going on, right? I don't like corporate domination for a start. So, and the current digital money system is completely corporate. It's run by the banking sector, right? And alongside a bunch of other players like the card companies, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, etc. Right? So the so-called cashless society is basically a sort of like a euphemism that's referring to a kind of bank/corporate run monetary system, a full privatization of money, right? But if you're interested in maintaining a balance of power in the monetary system, you want to essentially balance off the different players against each other. Okay, so I would tend to come from a more kind of like maybe like an anarchisty sort of background, which is more left wing. And in any anarchist framing of the world, the state and the corporate sector are going to be seen as basically the same thing, right? Sort of different parts of a ruling coalition, right? So there's no like distinction made between state and market, really, which is in libertarianism, there tends to be quite a strong distinction made between states and markets, and states are imagined to sort of almost be like a parasitic force that attacks the market. Whereas in sort of like anarchist readings of the world, markets are often seen to be extensions of states, at least large-scale markets. All right, so the state provides all the underpinning that allows all the corporates to work. Okay, so then you basically start to analyze them as being sort of different parts of the same kind of like whole. And in that, if you're looking at the kind of real politic of the monetary system, and you say like, okay, I would rather have a balance of power in the monetary system than have one player control the entire thing. Right. And
Yeah,
this,
and I
this is
agree
where
with
the
that.
cash argument comes in. Yeah. So the cash argument basically says, look, I don't want to romanticize cash. I don't want to say like it's like everyone should constantly use cash. But if you want to keep this balance of power, you've got to promote the cash system. It also promotes privacy. It also prevents exclusion, because there's lots of people in the world who don't get access to the banking sector, or else don't even trust the banking sector, don't want access to the banking sector. And also, it's just like there's also kind of a more sort of centrist argument, which is just simply around the resilience of the monetary system, right? So to say, like, look, if you want the monetary system to stand up, because bear in mind, an entire capitalist economy depends upon the monetary system standing up, you want to have the cash system is a very core part of maintaining the stability of the monetary system for various technical reasons. So there's a whole sort of range of actually cross ideological reasons why you might want to protect cash. And actually, there's lots of different political groups who can get on board with the overarching drive. But of course, in the crypto world, there is a pro cash element. But as I said, it tends to be more by privacy.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different forms of money. I think that's one of the most important things that I would like people to take away from your book, right? Is that, if you're born today, or maybe born post iPhone, right? Because that's kind of like how I differentiate the world now. There's pre-iPhone and then post iPhone, where, pre-iPhone, there was a separation of technology into different spheres, right? You had a computer, but it would sit on your desk and it wouldn't go with you everywhere. You had a phone, but it was on your wall and people would call you and you would pick it up and you would talk to them. But if you left your house, you'd either have to have a pager or something. Like when we got to the iPhone, we had this conglomeration of all these different individual technologies into a singular one, and now it's traveling with us now. So pre-iPhone, there was a differentiation of money. I mean, we didn't, for one thing, we didn't have all these different types of corporate money in the way it is now. And, you would have a checkbook and you would balance it and you'd have to do everything by hand. Now we have this amalgamation where you're moving between all of these different forms of money, moving from like Square or Stripe or PayPal into your bank account, or like into the crypto space, or like into like game credits on your Xbox, right? You have like all these different forms of money, which in the United States is a dollar, but you don't really think of the differences between all of these different systems, right? You just think, oh, hey, I have a dollar, I've sent it to Cash App, and then like, okay, well, I have now like USDC on Ethereum. I have that dollar on Ethereum somewhere, or like I've sent it off to PlayStation and I have some credit that I can use in the store later on, right? You just kind of think of it as like, it's this kind of like nebulous blob of money which exists digitally now. But what you cover in your book, and which I find extremely important as we go into this next decade, is that like as you go into these different systems, they all have different legal prescriptions and backings and contracts, which are all different, right? The money that's in your bank is not the same money that's in Cash App, and it's not the same money that you put into a Starbucks gift card, and it's not USDC. They're all completely different. They all have completely different contracts, and nobody, it's like that South Park episode, like nobody ever reads the fine print, right? And I think we're going to get to a point where we're going to have a reckoning at some point where the consumer protections that you have in a bank, and which were derived from thousands of years of social interactions, because banks are great, and I think this is actually one of the things which I don't like about the crypto movement is this like anti-bank messaging that they have, because banks are really safe. Like if you're a normal person, keeping your money in banks is fine, and really, like I highly recommend people to go read your book just to have a better, clear distinction between all these different types of money. And that's what I'm trying to do
also,
here.
If a person doesn't have time to read the book, there's also on my newsletter, which is brettscott.substack.com. I did a piece called The Casino Chip Society recently, which just shows all the different layers of money by using a casino chip metaphor, whereas, talk about going into a casino and you hand over cash and you get this casino chip, and that casino chip is essentially a sort of secondary form of money that's been issued by a private institution. And in many ways, the money that you see in your bank account is like a digital casino chip, and the money that you see in your PayPal account would be like a digital casino chip that promises you a bank casino chip, which promises you cash, right? So you see how they all get linked together. And I mean, I think this is, you're sort of saying how people don't differentiate. And in that piece, I refer to this as the atomy, the one type of money illusion. Yeah. And it's a very, very big problem psychologically that people have when they're imagining money. They imagine that it's just this one thing. And they often also imagine that digital money is just an upgrade to cash, almost like you were comparing a acoustic guitar to an electric guitar and saying, the one's just a sort of an electric version of the other. When in reality, they're two entirely different forms of money issued by different institutions. All right. And actually the US dollar, there was thousands of issuers of the US dollar. All right. The primary two issuers are the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. But then on top of that, there's the entire banking sector. Every single bank is issuing its own form of money, which is in this form of these sort of digital casino chips. And the main reason people don't perceive that often is that there's deposit insurance, which means that the state is going to guarantee those digital casino chips essentially, which basically means it feels quite safe. And you wouldn't really differentiate the units that you got in a bank account with say physical cash, because you think, they're sort of basically the same thing, right? That's because of deposit insurance. But then increasingly, these sort of third tier forms of money, which includes, for example, the stablecoin world, it's quite interesting. People, as you say, are perceiving them in this sort of like blob-like fashion. But as soon as one of those entities goes down, they'll very quickly realize that those casino chips that they're holding might, if the institution that issues them goes bankrupt, then suddenly they're very different to a Federal Reserve issued US dollar, right? So yeah, I mean, the US dollar system, there's probably tens of thousands of issuers of the US dollar, and it goes from like gift cards through to these like game currencies and stuff. But they're all in the end derive their power from the state institutions that issue the first layer of that money, right? Mm-hmm. Although there's obviously there's nuances when it comes to like your algorithmic stable coins and stuff like that, which are sort of artificially kind of constructing something that tracks the dollar rather than is linked directly to it.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to talk about crypto for a second, and then I want to get back to the corporate money. I know you've talked about Bitcoin before. I really don't see Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin's a commodity, right? It's something that goes up and down, but I really try to divorce the price of Bitcoin from the utility of what you do with it, right? Which is, you can own Bitcoin for one block, right? You can buy it and then transfer it in one block and be able to transfer value from one person to another within this kind of one block span, maybe six blocks to have confirmations. And during that time, you can transfer billions of dollars to anybody in the world, North Koreans, Iranians, whatever, right? That in itself is something which has utility. And then the speculative asset is just people speculating on how much utility people think it has, right? So that in itself, I think is really important when we talk about like the whole financial privacy and state surveillance stuff. But what I do think is really interesting.
I would put the polarity the other way around of what you just described, but sure.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, the speculators provide the liquidity for people that want to use the utility of it to have enough liquidity in the system to be able to send that amount of money, right? Because if the price of Bitcoin was only, I don't know, a dollar, and you wanted to send $50 million worth of Bitcoin to somebody, you wouldn't be able to. The market cap would be too small, right? But if you want to send $1 billion worth of Bitcoin to somebody, the market cap needs to be much higher, so the liquidity can be there, so you can make that payment. So I'm pretty divorced from the price. I think the price is the price. It is what people pay for it. It doesn't really mean anything. I think the interesting thing that crypto created was the ability, again, like to swap that briefcase back and forth to whomever you wanted to, which again, like you talked about.
The main distinction, main distinction though, is that crypto operates via a process called counter trade, which is something that I write about quite a lot. So counter trade is when you use a non-monetary object for exchange. Mm-hmm. And this gets a bit like into the weeds of sort of like monetary theory stuff. If your definition of money is the thing I use to exchange, then you're probably going to see something like Bitcoin as being money because you can use it to exchange, right? But if your definition of money is deeper than that, you start to see that actually there are many non-monetary things you can use for exchange via counter trade. All right. I can use anything that has a price for exchange. All right. So if I have a watch on my wrist that let's just use a watch, right? Yeah. Let's say it costs $100, and you had something that cost I don't know, $200. I could say, hey, I'll give you 2 of these watches for that thing. Now it would sort of like superficially look like I'm using the watches as a type of money, but in reality, what I'm actually doing is I'm implicitly reselling them on the market for $200 and then giving it to you. All right. And this is basically a process called counter trade. And this is how every single Bitcoin purchase works. And I know this because I've used Bitcoin a lot. All right. Yeah. So basically, you look at the speculative market, you see what the price in the speculative market for Bitcoin tokens is. And then you will say, look at some object that's supposedly priced in Bitcoin. And really what's going on, you'll be calculating a counter trade ratio to say, like, what's the actual US dollar price of the thing I'm trying to get, and how much Bitcoin would I have to sell to get that amount of US dollars, right? And I'll give you that amount of Bitcoin, right? And that's how all the Bitcoin purchases work. So really, when you look at Bitcoin, what's interesting about it and what's subversive about it is actually it doesn't really compete with the monetary system. It sort of rides on top of the monetary system. Like Bitcoiners don't like it when I say that because it sort of goes against the ideology, but it's the reality of how it actually works. And that could actually be very useful. All right. It's not an insult to the Bitcoin community. It's just a sort of the reality of how it operates. So it actually it sort of like rides on top of the existing system via counter trade. And of course, this does become a new way to exchange. So if I want to bypass the banking sector and I want to bypass forms of surveillance, I can do counter trade with Bitcoin to get around that, right? Which would sort of be like, it would actually be different to passing the briefcase full of dollar bills. It'd be more like passing a briefcase full of like collectibles or something like that to somebody, right? But it can definitely work like that. That is actually a useful way to maybe do an exchange, but that you can do that to bypass the system. But just bear in mind that how it's working is that it's actually deriving its exchangeability from its US dollar price.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is a process called counter trade. And I would say the crypto world has ushered in a new era of counter trade, because previously, like, using that example, like if I was literally trying to like send a person a briefcase full of like antiques as a way of exchange, it's a very like clumsy process, right? Whereas crypto tokens or the things like Bitcoin tend to be very easy to send. They're very easy to counter trade. You can do it across borders, and that actually is super useful.
Right. So when you're talking about the medallions, right, the person who's accepting them is taking on liquidity risk. And the thing about Bitcoin is that it's a very, very, very liquid market. Not as liquid as the US dollar, but it's liquid enough to be able to handle the types of transactions that you're talking about. So say if you wanted to exchange, $100 billion into something else, right? And you wanted to accept Bitcoin, there's enough liquidity in the system that you could probably sell your Bitcoin with minimal slippage to be able to make that transaction. You're right. I don't think it competes. Bitcoin as a thing sits adjacent to debt-based money, which is where most of money is today, right? So money that's created by the Fed then flows down into commercial banks and then is distributed out as either notes or account or money that's in your bank account, or even money that is a stable coin, right? Even like DAI and other algorithmic stable coins like FrxETH, I mean, they're still at a point debt-based money where there's a money claim at its core. Bitcoin doesn't really have a money claim, and so it just exists as this kind of like speculative agent. So when talking about money claims, and I think this is kind of what you're getting to in the point, is that some money claims are stronger than others. And that as you get further away from the Fed, right? So the Fed has the strongest money claim, where it says like, we can print as much money as we want, and our money is always good, right? So when we issue treasuries, when we issue bonds, these money-like instruments will always have the full faith and force of the credit of the country that's issuing them, in this case, the United States. But as soon as you move down into the commercial sector, then the claims start to become weaker, right? Because the loans that the bank is issuing implicitly have weaker claims, because it's no longer the Fed that's issuing them; it's now a bank. And so now, when you talk about money claims, the question is not one of is this money, because it still is money. It becomes a question of what is the put, or what is the the thing that's backing it in case anything goes wrong. So, you mentioned insurance or deposit insurance, which is a form of like it's a public-private form of insurance to act as this put in case anything goes wrong. Or if you're banking with like a commercial bank, they may have different forms of insurance that you can use. When you get way far out into these like shadow banks or into the corporate sector, if Cash App were to go under, if PayPal were to go under, I don't think they have a put, or I don't think they have a form of insurance, deposit insurance, that would save the people's money if there is anything that happened to the company. I mean, it comes down to the.
Bear in mind that players like PayPal and stuff are fully reserved, right? So,
right.
At least in theory, a PayPal unit should be backed by a bank unit somewhere else in the system.
Well, it would come to. I think the point I wanted to make is that as you get further and further away from the Fed, you become beholden to those terms and conditions that I was talking about.
Yeah.
So like you could have money at PayPal, but unless you know the full terms and conditions of what the contract that you're entering in with PayPal to keep your money there, you wouldn't, you have to, you can't manage all these things. Like how are you supposed to know the terms and conditions at Cash App versus PayPal versus like USDC versus, your bank, like, and all the other different systems that you own. Right. And so there's no, like, I think one of the things politically and that we could do is like homogenize all of this, right? Where we figure out, and this obviously is a very complex issue, but figuring out how these money claims.
Sure. I mean, one thing to bear in mind is that there is different legislation that governs what these players are allowed to do. So players like PayPal, Cash App and stuff are going to come under, I don't know what it's called in the US, but like e-money regulation, right? Which is basically talks about these third tier players. So if you look at the state as the first tier, the banking sector is the second tier, and then these sort of commercial players is the third tier. The sort of e-money licenses basically saying like, if you want to have customer accounts where you're telling a person that they've got dollars in an account somewhere, you better have some mechanism via which you actually are backing that. You can't be doing fractional reserve, essentially. All right. Whereas the banking sector, that doesn't apply to the banking sector. The banking sector is allowed to expand its liabilities. So if I was using that like casino chip metaphor, banks are a little bit like casinos that are able to issue out far more chips than they have in state money reserves. All right. So they can basically expand out their liabilities, which would what we would call our money, right, in the banking sector. And that's what they do that when they're issuing loans, right? So the banking sector essentially pushes out loads of these digital chips into society, right? And that's got all its own regulations. So all the kind of like bank solvency and like all the different types of like, ratios and all that stuff is to do with trying to govern the stability of that process. But then the third tier players like PayPal, they're not allowed to do that. PayPal's not allowed to just randomly issue out, loads and loads of PayPal chips without having some kind of like what in the crypto world would be called proof of reserves. All right.
Right.
And I suppose so to some extent there is regulation that tries to, I guess, like harmonize or to provide some degree of security. Because if it was discovered, for example, that PayPal actually had zero reserves backing all the units, it would very, very quickly get in a lot of trouble, right?
Right. But like the issues around like essentially what you're describing is like a bank run where the liabilities that a company or a bank or somebody has cannot be met at the time of people wanting to take their money out. And typically in a bank runs always come down to like duration risk, right? So you're taking in money short term and you're lending it out long term. And so you have this kind of like gap between like I don't know. So you've lent out money for like a year, but you have these deposits that, can be taken out at any time. And this is where a lot of like the backstops and banking regulations come in. And essentially the Fed coming in to provide that put that it has for the commercial banking sector every time something in the economy goes wrong, is because there's a duration risk at all these banks. So you saw this.
I mean, I would put it differently.
Yeah. So I think that what you can see where, like, in the public private sector, in the banking sector, that form of Fed intervention is pretty much necessary, right? But when you get into the private sector, you no longer have those protections anymore. And you could look at something like in the crypto space, like Celsius, where people lent their money to Celsius thinking, oh, hey, they're kind of like a bank, but actually they're not. They're a private company that lent those assets out, got hacked, lost money, has a ton of duration risk, is not able to get their funds back. And now once the company went under, they're now governed by the terms and conditions of the institution. Banks have these implicit guarantees about the Fed being able to cover in case there's a bank run. But when you get into private companies, you no longer have that protection anymore, where a company like Celsius, who's taking in customer deposits, lending them out to institutions, kind of got stuck where they lost a bunch of money. Then they also had a bunch of money locked up with duration risk. And then essentially customers pulled all their money out and triggered a bank run, and then they went under. And
well, I mean, actually, there's a better way to think about the crypto. A lot of those companies like that is a bit more like hedge funds and stuff like that. Right now, if I'm a person in the pre-crypto world, at least if I was like a rich person, I would have a choice. I could go and keep my money in the form of bank deposits, or else I could go and like put it into some kind of like fund that would be lending out, right? And funds are not banks. I mean, funds, like, once a fund lends out the money, it's no longer there, right? And they're basically going to give you some kind of residual claim and say, like, we will like pay you out at some point, but we can't guarantee that we're going to redeem this at any point. I mean, like, they often have to freeze customer redemptions in funds because they don't have the ability to redeem them. And actually, a lot of these crypto players are a bit more like the sort of fund management world in that sense. They might have a sort of partial ability to redeem customer deposits if they have enough, but if they've lent it all out, they've literally lent it all out, right? It's not there. Whereas in the banking sector, banks don't lend out their customer deposits. I mean, this is you got to understand banking to know this, but like, banks will keep reserves and they issue out digital chips, all right? So the banking sector can always, like, I didn't explain that very well, but like, a lot of people still have this idea that banks lend out the money that people give to the bank. I mean, that's just technically incorrect, right? Banks will create new money, all right? That's what their loans are, is
commercial
newly
banks, right?
Created units of. Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the mechanics of banks, which is totally different to the mechanics of funds. All right.
Right.
So with a fund doesn't have any ability to create new money. It can only work with money that's been created by money issuers, which include the state and the banking sector. Right. And so in the world of the funds, there is this kind of like scarcity of money that exists. All right. If I'm a fund and I've lent out all the money, I can't conjure it up again. Right. Whereas in the banking sector, this is not the case. So there's a lot of these, like, so supposed crypto banks are really a lot more like a kind of, close-ended fund or something like that, or open-ended fund or some sort.
So what do you find as your preferred, like, because you worked in the banking system for a while, like, what do you see as your preferred form of money? Is it like the fun method, or do you like how the banking system has been set up, at least on the retail side? The commercial side is a little bit different, obviously, but the way that the state creates money and distributes it through banks, do you think this is an optimal system, or do you like this kind of narrative that's been coming up about the move towards like CBDCs and being able to direct or bank directly with the Fed? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I'm a big defender of physical cash, right? So physical cash is layer one state issued physical units of money, right? And I think there's a lot of physical cash is interesting because it blends a bunch of different things together. It kind of has the power of the state, but without the like attendant surveillance of something like a CBDC, right? So CBDC would be like layer one digital money issued by the state, right? But that then comes with a whole bunch of new problems, which includes all those like libertarian concerns around privacy and the ability to control. Whereas cash has the sort of like the psychological and sort of legal power of the state, but actually enables all sorts of like decentralized and localized interactions and quite sort of human interactions to go on, right? So that's like one thing I'm defending, but of course I don't like use cash for everything, right? Like,
of course.
I understand that we live in a hybrid system, so I use the banking sector. But anyway, I don't really have a preferred. My preference is really to have balances of power, right? So I like to have. I'm not romantic about any particular player. What I like to have is some sort of like. I don't want any of them dominating. And one of the metaphors that are often used to convey this is to speak about cash as being like the bicycle of payments, whereas the bank system is like the Uber of payments. Okay. Now, it's totally possible to actually like riding your bike and also getting Ubers occasionally, right? The real sort of issue comes in is when you have no choice but to use, like, for example, if your entire transport system was controlled by Uber, suddenly it would start to seem a lot more nefarious than it did before, right? The reason that a company like Uber doesn't seem nefarious is precisely is that you have an option to not use it, all right? So you can sort of say like, oh, it's a Friday night, I'm trying to get home, fine, I'm going to use this cool thing. But imagine if like the only way you were allowed to travel was through Uber. Suddenly it would start to seem very, very oppressive. It would start to seem very sort of domineering. It controls your ability to move. You lose all your autonomy, all right? And this is why I believe that the positive sides of any particular system only comes out when it's balanced off by other systems, right? So that's basically what I'm often sort of arguing for. So cash being the bicycle of payments. But then, of course, you can develop other metaphors for other types of payment systems. I actually even like the fact that you can do like counter trade with sort of crypto tokens. I think that actually is a useful thing in a world where you have like surveillance states. I've also been involved in lots of pre-crypto alternative money type of project. So, Cloudmoney as a book is really looking at the existing monetary system and trying to sort of balance out the power dynamics within it. But I do have a kind of an idealistic side as well that looks at community currencies and mutual credit systems and all these other like interesting and creative experiments in money. So I am very positive about people trying to experiment. But at the same time, sometimes when you're in those communities, they get very utopian and they get sort of a little bit obsessed by these kind of like very sort of quite marginal experiments. And the reality is that for most people in the world, these small scale, like interesting esoteric alternatives are probably not going to be the thing that's going to be helping them right now. But in my ideal world, I would love to see like, an efflorescence of like an upwelling of lots of cool, interesting community currencies and sort of like, personally issued IOU credits and this kind of stuff, right? So there's lots of interesting space to explore in monetary design, and I do like write about that as well and sort of support people who are trying to do those kind of things.
So were you part of the Occupy movement back in 2008, or were you covering that back then?
I was actually working in the financial sector back then and over-the-counter derivative contracts. But yeah, I went along to the Occupy protests like a bit. Ideologically, I would support the Occupy movement. But I was in the midst of a kind of like immersion in the world of high finance, an adventure maybe, just sort of exploring. So I wasn't like heavily involved, but I know I'm quite heavily influenced by David Graeber, who's a monetary anthropologist, and he was a big figure in Occupy. But David Graeber is like a kind of guru figure for a lot of people who are into credit theories of money, which is like my kind of like thing, where you see money as this kind of like system of promises and system of like credits. And a lot of sort of a lot of those sort of alternative money movements that I was mentioning, the sort of pre-crypto alternative currency movements, a lot of them are influenced by credit theories of money. What's quite interesting in the crypto movements, especially with Bitcoin, it became very heavily influenced by commodity theories of money.
Right.
And in the history of money, you tend to find these sort of maybe theories is the wrong word. Actually, I'd just say orientations, like a kind of way of approaching money. And the commodity orientation and the credit orientation are these two sort of competing orientations to how you start to sort of approach money. And anybody who's interested in sort of monetary design should kind of like get to the bottom of those sort of like intuitions.
Yeah, so when talking about money, right, there's like the price of money, right, which is like par and foreign exchange and like price levels, right? So like price levels would be like commodities, right? But I really think that when you look at like the '08 Occupy movement, and also tied in with what crypto is trying to do now, I think the biggest thing that I look at it when I see it is, again, coming back to credit, is just the cost of credit for different entities and who has access to that credit. So, one of the big things that the Occupy movement was getting on about was like, oh, we're in the middle of like zero interest rate policy. Here's these banks which get special treatment and essentially can borrow for nothing, right? Like they're getting all this free money, but you and I, as regular plebs, just have to borrow. When we go to borrow, we're paying, Fed funds rate plus, or like LIBOR plus 2, 3, 4, 5%, or in the case of credit cards, like 25%, or even in the case of like payday loans, like getting up into the several 100% APR, right? So I see it as a system of access, both in credit, and then once you get outside the United States and outside the euro, as a system of who has access to dollars, right? And if you think about the credit system as like who has the best credit, right? So the dollar has the best liquidity and the best credit because it's the global reserve currency. But unfortunately, not everybody has access to that dollar system in the same way that Americans do. And even in America, there's stratification amongst retail to institution to commercial banks to whomever's closer to the Fed, right? Always is going to have access to better credit, better liquidity, and can have more options about what they want to do with that credit, right? And then as you get further away, once you go into Latin America, once you go into Africa, once you go into Asia and parts, access to dollars is restricted both from the United States and then also internally as well too. So like if you're an Argentinian or who wants to get dollars to escape the inflation of your country, they have huge restrictions on dollar purchases there. I think you can only swap like $1,000 a month or something. It's something really restrictive at officially for Argentina. Obviously, there's like private black market ways to swap into dollars, but officially they make it very hard to hold dollars in a bank account. And then secondarily to that, it's extremely hard to get good interest rates in those countries, right? So like taking a dollar-based loan in Argentina or Africa or somewhere is going to be much more expensive than taking it in the United States. And so that cost of credit and the access to dollars creates huge barriers globally for people to, I mean, when you talk about financial inclusion, that's what I think about, right? is access to credit. And so when I think of crypto, at least I think it as a way of democratizing credit in a sense where, you can go onto Aave or Compound and everybody's getting the same rate, right? Everybody's borrowing at the same rate. Sure, it's variable, but you know that the person with $1 billion is going to be borrowing at the same rate as the person with $100. And I think that democratization of open credit and open finance is the thing that was really needed and came out of 2008 through Bitcoin trying to do something there, but now through this, open finance, DeFi, whatever you want to call it, system of trying to democratize credit systems in a way.
I mean, I kind of like have a sympathy, for the DeFi like mission to some extent. There's a lot of naivety in the DeFi space. I mean, bear in mind, something like financial inclusion is a very holistic, a multifaceted thing, right? So it's just a very, very simple example of this is like the mere fact of giving somebody credit is not going to help a person, right? Unless they have a meaningful way to engage in some productive activity that will enable them to pay it back. So for example, with microcredit and microloans, microfinance, one of the big things that initially happened with the first wave of microfinance was, all these people getting these small loans, but then actually being in an economic situation that didn't allow them to actually do something productive that it would then enable them to get out of those loans. So they just end up in debt. Right. Yeah. So if you give people credit without having actual structural opportunities, you end up with indebtedness. All right.
Yeah.
So the sort of credit aspect in terms of like lending out money is sort of one aspect of a broader puzzle. And if you're sort of looking, I come from a background in sort of international development as well, which is sort of looking at economic development and the different sort of factors at play. But for example, in a country like Zimbabwe, where my family's from, like the first thing you need to do to like get economic empowerment is not to give people credit. You need to like build infrastructure. All right. If I go and give, credit to sort of small scale artisans somewhere, but they don't have the ability to say like get their goods onto a road to transport it to a port, that's going to be like no good, right? Actually, so for example, right now in Zimbabwe, what's happening is the Chinese state is coming in and building huge amounts of infrastructure, right? Actually, if you ask Zimbabweans, like, what's most useful to you here, they'll be like, the infrastructure is most useful to us by far.
Yeah.
All right. Rather than the sort of the UN agency coming in and trying to give us microcredit, right? So I think that the DeFi movement needs to just sort of like, I'm not against that at all, but I think it just needs to sort of, not get too much hubris, because you realize these problems are often quite complex and often involve sort of a number of different factors working together. Also, another thing to bear in mind in sort of your points about like the US dollar and access to the US dollar is that many countries don't want to be dominated by the US dollar. There's a whole bunch of sort of international geopolitics around which currency you use. So if you are in Argentina, for example, it might be the case that if you're like a middle-class citizen in Argentina and you're like, it'll be great if we could just use US dollars, right? But like, if you suddenly just use US dollars, you basically become a kind of like, if your whole country was doing that, you sort of become a kind of you kind of become like a new state of the United States, but without any political power. All right.
It's like what's happening in El Salvador, right?
Yeah, basically dollarization in these countries basically leaves them as kind of like second tier monetary citizens without any say in the stuff, right? And the problem is that in any economy, while you might sort of complain about the government and be like, the corrupt government, the reality is that in any large scale capitalist market, private sector players themselves don't create the infrastructure that's required to have successful markets. You don't see like the owners of supermarkets building the roads and building the ports and stuff that's going to make this stuff work. Actually, these states are often required before the companies can become successful. So if you're suddenly like hollowing out the state by destroying its monetary system, you're going to hollow out the private sector at the same time, right? So you might have a bunch of citizens in Argentina who are suddenly able to like use US dollars, but they're going to be like, the whole economy is going to be totally kneecapped. So I think this is the thing to bear in mind is to sort of like look at this, the kind of the political elements of the monetary politics, because, even in Zimbabwe, where my family's from, Zimbabwe, it depends on the US dollar now, right? It became its own currency was destroyed. But if you had to ask local Zimbabweans, it's like, in your ideal scenario, would you want to have some degree of political autonomy over your economy, or do you want to be dependent upon the US? They would say, ideally, we'd actually want our own system, right? We don't want to be forever dependent upon the decisions of the Federal Reserve Board,
Right.
which we have no say in whatsoever.
Well, I think
So
that was kind of that was the intended goal of like these libertarian moneymakers, right? Like Satoshi and whatever. It was to create a I don't even want to call it a non-political. It's more like a supra-political, where it's above, not outside, but above the existing national political system, where you could create a form of money that essentially competes with everything else, and like you said, provides a check, right? Like I don't think DeFi as it is right now could ever subsume or do the things that is going on in the commercial banking sector in its form right now. Like you described right now, it doesn't have the ability to do that. But what it does is, like, if you want to move your money outside of the system, right, as a check, into something where, if you want to move out of the peso and into the dollar somewhere, and then have a digital offshore bank account, you're more than able to now. And so you can escape the authoritarianism or inflation or whatever is inside of your country, and have a new way to protest against the monetary conditions within inside the country, right? And I think that's what, yeah.
As long as you realize that is a sort of more like a short-term tactical play rather than a long-term like strategic solution, right? I think that's part of the problem in the crypto world is often that some people in the crypto world tend to like get a bit hyperbolic, a bit like full of hubris, all right, and they without really thinking through how the global economy actually works, all right? Like de facto, the entire global capitalist system works on like supply chains that depend upon like, Chinese laborers and like cobalt from the DRC. Like there's a huge structure, a huge legal structure, a huge nation state structure that underpins all global markets, right? Now, it's important to take that seriously. It's important to critique that, but also to take it seriously, right? And it's important to realize that, a sort of new digital layer doesn't necessarily somehow magically overcome the reality of most people's lives, right? And so in that sense, to sort of see it as being a sort of counterpower system to enable sort of, sort of like strategies on the side of that system, right? And to sort of start to work towards how do you create forms of balances of power, and that becomes interesting, right?
But isn't that kind of how modern democracy or modern like liberalism, big L liberalism came about, right? Out of the 6th or 18th century, right? Was that we have this understanding that we can't really design perfect systems, right? No matter how much information we have, no matter how broad a surveillance economy is, we just don't have like complete insight into the human factor. And so it's impossible for us to design systems. There's always going to be some mistakes or imbalances or just deficiencies in the systems that we create, right? So the best things that we can do is to create a bunch of different systems that have, like you said, balances of checks and balances, so that, if one thing is getting too strong, people have the ability to escape into a different system or a different type of money. And if you look at how the legal systems were set up in pretty much every single modern democracy that functions now, you have this understanding that there are core power structures which need to be separated and then checked by another power structure. So I tend to agree with that. Like I don't have any major qualms with, I understand there's always going to be issues with like how money works at the national level or in the corporate level, but again, at the end of the day, it's about having insight and transparency into those systems, and then having the ability to build alternative systems in case people want to exit.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think, and that's what I was sort of saying in a way, is as long as there's a degree of humility in the way these systems are thought of, they're totally fine. I think some of the public backlash against the crypto rhetoric tends to be about some of the sort of the arrogance of some of the people who sort of try to claim that these systems are somehow like infallible or like totally free of fraud and totally, all this kind of stuff, which is increasingly being revealed to be. So I think what's going to be interesting going forward in the crypto space is, especially post FTX and all this kind of stuff, is to and post also like Luna and these things, is to like the sort of new generation of crypto entrepreneurs who might be sort of a bit like less hyperbolic, less full of hubris, less arrogant, and actually being like, look, we're going to try and like figure out how our systems interact with these much more powerful systems that surround us and figure out interesting stuff. And I think that's, a very creative area. And I'm always like supportive of people who are trying to do interesting things. I personally don't like a lot of the kind of, let's call it like libertarianism 101 type thinking that sometimes you find in the crypto space. It's kind of very crude versions of libertarianism where it's like, every nation state is just some kind of like tyrannical ruler. And like, there's a lot of like hypocrisy and sort of like double think that goes on in crypto. And to some extent, it's a marketing layer for the crypto space. I tend to find it a bit obnoxious, but like I can also sort of look past that and be like, okay, there is a lot of interesting stuff that's going on, but don't get too, literally we see it every single time in crypto. When people get too arrogant and cocky, their systems go down and it reveals a giant like, failure happens, which is not unique to crypto. I used to work in banking in the sort of world of investment banking and trading. A lot of the traders in sort of 2008 and stuff were super, super arrogant, believed that they could like, all their systems were infallible, and that a lot of them were totally useless. Right. So I think this is like a repetitive pattern in human history. Is there's lots of this like hubris and hype and stuff, and then there's a sort of a kind of a reckoning where people are forced to be, sort of get a bit more humility, and I think the systems become a lot more interesting after that point. So I think the next few years in crypto could actually be quite interesting.
Yeah, I look back on like all the history of that, right? Is that you have these extremely complex systems where you're not able to, one person's not able to see the forest through the trees, right? There's just trees, right? And kind of thinking about the forest, you're never going to be able to fly 100 miles up into the sky and get the exact like fixture of how the forest is, because it's constantly evolving and growing. And then when there's a fire or a storm or some sort of calamity that comes through, your understanding of what that entity is, that forest, is completely destroyed. And then you have to start again and kind of like piece the bits together and kind of understand, well, when something bad happens next time, what are we going to do about it? Right. I think so I agree with what you're saying about the hubris in crypto. It's just weird sometimes, and especially like how a lot of education that's done is more about I'm a firm believer in self-sovereignty and liberty and everything, but I don't really see it as like the primary means of what crypto's trying to do. I see it more as like an ability to have, like you said, an alternative, a way to balance the system. And essentially, like if you're in a marginalized community, like if you're an Iranian, right, and you're born into a system, you're born into a financial system which is like against you just because of the place on earth which you were born. I don't really see that as a negative. I think you shouldn't have to bear the brunt of a small subset of people's decisions just because of the place that you were born. And I hope that we can. I don't think that's ever going to go away because we have all these political differences which can't really be reconciled. But hopefully we can build new systems which provide alternatives for people, even though they may be looked down upon or politically distasteful or illegal in that sense.
Yeah, no, I mean it's. I think maybe just like the one thing I'd encourage anybody who's who's I guess like listening in terms of when you're sort of doing the analysis around the projects, is just to try and like and I've been around sort of economic stuff for like a really long time, so I have some like practice at sort of seeing the systemic picture. But it's to sort of like see that every person is often caught in a whole series of like you got to see like the holistic picture. So like I totally agree with you. There'll be people born in Iran who are in a situation who like in a sort of structurally subordinated position. But for example, Venezuela is often used as an example. One of the reasons why Venezuela is in a structurally subordinated position is because of U.S. Domination of the global economy, where Venezuela becomes essentially an oil exporter to the US, right? And a lot of these countries have become sort of commodity exporters to the US. So like, like a person sitting in the US is getting all these goods and services from somewhere in the world, right? And they're like, well, within our space, we've got these democratic processes. But a lot of the goods and services in the US depend upon various other countries not having those same processes, all right? And being sort of structurally subordinated. All right. So if you say something like, oh, well, all the poor people in Venezuela, it's like, well, the poor people in Venezuela are very much linked to your life in the US. Right. There's a globally interconnected system that they're part of. All right. And so I'm not saying you can do anything about that, but just to be aware of all the sort of structural level systemic positions people are in, and then to be careful of advocating for non-structural solutions. So, I'm a person, I come from a quite a sort of anarchisty way of thinking about the world. Anarchists often do these sort of small scale, like things like build a small scale alternative. But you always got to be aware that like that's not going to solve the structural problem necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that just as long as a person is aware of that, aware of the limitations of their systems and what they really, what they can actually do, then it's, I'm kind of waffling on now, but hopefully this point's coming through. It becomes you can do a lot more useful things when you have a realistic assessment of sort of structure of the global economy. And I guess I get fed up a bit of people sort of like having these sort of magical solutions where they're like, oh well, as long as we could parachute some kind of like token down to these people here, they're going to suddenly be fine. It's like
no. So how do you see it? Do you see it more as a because I know your previous book was about like activism and about how to kind of instill financial activism. Do you see it more as like a bottom up movement, or do you see it as hey, we need to take the means of power and design something from the top down, or is it like a kind of mixture hybrid?
Yeah, my first book was A Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, and that came out at post-Occupy movement, and that was a guide to activists on sort of creative strategies of like resistance against financial institutions. And it had a lot of like fun things like, try to build your own hedge fund. And there's like a lot of these like ideas, but I would describe The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance as being very sort of, I'd use the word tactical, in the sense that it was like, what can you do as a sort of small individual in a vast system? All right. Mm-hmm. You're probably not going to be able to change an entire system, but you can probably do these little like jams, these like hacks, these kind of like small scale things. Right. So, and that can be empowering if you're an individual, but it doesn't mean that that's going to translate into some kind of like widespread change in the world. All right.
Yeah.
And so, there's a limitation in that way of thinking, and the sort of the hacker mentality where you're like, I'm a sort of solo individual against the system. I mean, look, there's going to be limitations to that kind of thinking, right? Yeah. So realistically, if you're looking at the sort of, you got to go political. My new book, the Cloudmoney is much more sort of, it would be like end up with policy proposals on like protecting the cash system, and that's not done through, that's done through like state legislation type stuff. So I think there's a role for lots of different types of actions. I think, I get frustrated with people who have no belief in the democratic process. I feel like if you let go that territory and you just say, all politics is a load of like, BS and there's no point, then I mean, like, the reality is that like you got to get involved in that stuff, and actually you can steer. There's better and worse versions of states. You can like steer them in better ways or worse ways. So I have a lot of friends who work on trying to like lobby and write new legislation, new proposals, and can actually be very empowering if it's done right. So I
Maybe
think
they're
there's a
just poor
range of
students
different
of
actions.
history. Maybe they're just poor students of history, right? Like,
sure.
we grow up and like we hear all these stories about, how democracies came about, and the blood that was spilled to form them, right? And small groups of rebels who overthrew massive authoritarian power to enable individual democracy, right? Some sort of like either republic democracies or democracies that you have inside of Europe, right? Like that in itself of getting there is a like huge achievement, and it shouldn't be lost on anyone that it can easily be lost, right? Like the both right and like I'm a like I think with horseshoe theory, like both right and left power kind of comes back to the same place of like death, destruction, authoritarianism, right? They both go to the same place. And so you kind of have to be in the opposite of either of those sides, like right in the middle of some sort of centrist view of like, hey, like we can't move politically too far in one direction, either one or the other, without getting in too much trouble. So let's just fight it out in Congress or through legislation or through the courts or through somewhere, like make it slow, make it hard to change, make the discourse extremely like hard to have. I mean, it's hard to have a democracy because you have to talk about things, right? And I think people like look at it and they just don't want to have those conversations because, it's, you have to form your ideas into coherent thoughts and then put it out. And in a place of 24-hour news, like it's easy just to be like, I just want to turn it off. I just want to have like, I get done with work. I want to go and I want to just like watch TV. I want to watch Friends reruns and, like turn off for the evening. Cause like life is stressful and I don't want to have to worry about that. But like being political is just being a part of life. Right. Politics is like the polity, right? It's the group, right? You can't have group without group disagreements. And so,
Sure.
We have to engage in civil discussion and decision about how we want to live as a group to be able to function as a society. And to be able to, like you said, to throw it off is it's just being a bad student of history and not understanding the social dynamics about how we all live together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's probably, yeah, I was going to say that's probably a good place to wrap up. For anybody
chat this.
Yeah. For anybody who hasn't heard so far, Brett is again the author of Cloudmoney, Cash, Cards, Crypto, and the War for Our Wallets. Definitely an amazing book. You should go out and read it. I really enjoyed it. There'll be a link in the show notes. And I think the one thing to take away is that like, well, Brett sits over on the left and I probably sit more on like the libertarian side of things. This conversation shows that we share a lot of the same ideas about like money and about what it should be used for and about kind of some of the threats that are coming from big tech and big government and other things. And if there's one thing that you should take away is that probably most other people share those as well. So this is why I say that you should read his book. Sure. The policy at the end of the day may not be the same. We may not agree on everything, but at least we can see some core tenets about like what we should fight against. And that I think is the most important thing.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Sam.
Yeah. Thanks, Brett. Thanks for coming on.
Everything said on this episode is not financial or tax advice. This channel is strictly for educational purposes and is not an investment advice or solicitation to buy or sell any assets or to make any financial decisions. This video is not tax advice whatsoever. Please talk to your accountant and do your own research.